Studies majors, over 200 of them and growing, and also the person who really started the lecture series about 10 years ago, and the International Studies is all together. And we have Ken Carpenter, who has just joined our team and teaches the capstone seminar. And Julie Williams, our graduate assistant and also colleague, she teaches a class in the English department and is doing her Ph.D. in English. Jasmine Knight, who prefers to stay in her office and continue emailing and minding the shop, is our indefatigable operations specialist. And with that, I would like to move on to today's program. First of all, heartfelt thanks to both the speakers and the commentators who have agreed to come and participate, because it is their engagement and response to the topic that is making this possible. Before you all leave, there is also a 5:30 lecture today by David Henkel in this room. Also, this wouldn't have been possible without the support of the university, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office of the Provost, University College, Peace Studies, and the History Department. And if I forgot anyone, I will mention it next time. And from outside sponsors, even more generous, I have to say, are the National New Mexico Humanities Council and the National Endowment for the Humanities, as well as the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence and the European Union, who are funding some of the speakers and the overall event. And with that, I am very happy to introduce my good friend and colleague, Les Field, who will introduce the speaker.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Alex Lubin, who will be speaking today, and the title of his presentation is What Comes After the American Century. He's a professor, full professor, and chair in the American Studies Department here at UNM, and was chair of that department as well before his sojourn at the American University of Beirut at the Center for American Studies and Research, or CASAR, from 2011 to 2013. At AUB and in CASAR, he planned and launched that center's MA program in Transnational American Studies. This is his most recent book. It just came out this year. It's called Geographies of Liberation, The Making of an Afro-American Political Imaginary. And a well-known African-American colleague and professor named Robin D.G. Kelly, who's professor of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC, said this is the book he wishes he wrote. So that's a very, very high praise. He's also the author of some other books, Romance and Rights, The Politics of Interracial Intimacy, 1945 to 1954. And some of his other notable works are as editor of Revising the Blueprint and Petrie and the Literary Left, and he's the co-editor of some forthcoming titles, American Studies Between the American Century and the Arab Spring, which I think probably has some themes that will be talked about today, and The Cultural Front in the U.S. War on Terror. He's had articles appear in the South Atlantic Quarterly, the American Quarterly, Studies in Jewish American Literature, the Journal of Africana Religions, The Nation, and in a very, really increasingly high-profile online journal called Jadaliyya, which was just covered in the New York Times this past weekend as a major news source for thinking, progressive thinking in the Middle East, which I urge you all to check out, and which he's actually on the editorial board of. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Alex Lubin.
Thank you. Thanks, Les, and thank you to the International Studies Institute for inviting me. And thank you all for coming out on a nice sunny day during the lunch hour. This is a talk that really combines a lot of topics in an attempt to sort of construct a narrative, both about the rise of what cultural historians and some diplomatic historians call the American century, as well as to document what comes after the American century. There's a lot of, there's a proliferation of scholarly work on the decline of American power, the post-American century, whether the United States is losing prestige. Just this week, China took over the United States for having the largest global economy. So there's a lot of discussion about what that means, and I want to, at least offer one possible reading of that. So I'll just begin here. In 1941, Henry Luce, the prolific owner of Life magazine, published his influential essay, The American Century, in which he defined the contours of the post-World War II era. Writing before U.S. entry into World War II, however, Luce argued that the United States was poised to become a global leader within the West, and that the nation had an indispensable, if not providential, role to play in global affairs. Luce sought to sway the United States government into joining World War II and to argue against the perceived isolationism of the Roosevelt administration. Were the United States to enter the war and to replace European allies within the Atlantic world for economic and geopolitical primacy, the United States, Luce argued, would be poised to assume the mantle of global leadership through America's unique ability to combine free markets and free people. As Luce wrote, quote, "It is for America and for America alone to determine whether a system of free economic enterprise, an economic order compatible with freedom and progress, shall or shall not prevail in this century. We have to decide whether or not we shall have for ourselves and our friends freedom of the seas, the right to go with our ships and our ocean-going airplanes where we wish, when we wish, and as we wish. The vision of America as the principal guarantor of freedom of the seas, the vision of America as the dynamic leader of world trade, has within it the possibilities of such enormous human progress as to stagger the imagination. Let us not be staggered by it," Luce said. "Let us rise to its tremendous possibilities," unquote. Combined with the United States' ability to protect and spread the free market, and hence global freedom, according to Luce, was the United States' exceptional ability to value self-determination in the international sphere and to respect the rule of law. Quote, "America as the dynamic center of ever-widening spheres of enterprise. America as the training center of the skillful servants of mankind. America as the Good Samaritan. Really believing again that it is more blessed to give than to receive. And America as the powerhouse of the ideals of freedom and justice. Out of these elements can be fashioned a vision of the 20th century, to which we can and will devote ourselves in joy and gladness and vigor and enthusiasm," unquote. In the 1940s, of course, Luce was referred to as, quote, "the most influential private citizen in the United States." His magazine holdings, Time, Life, Fortune, and Sports Illustrated, established him as America's first media mogul and a tastemaker in American public life. While the values of free markets and free societies that was promoted in Luce's popular magazines and his seminal essay, The American Century, were popular and read widely, the geopolitical realities of the American century were articulated elsewhere, in the halls of Washington, where the federal government developed a roadmap to realize Luce's vision of the American century. Following World War II, with the ascendance of the United States as a global power and the start of the Cold War and its bipolar world order, U.S. State Department officials sought to realize a vision for the American century. The National Security Council issued Policy Document 68, NSC 68, in April 1950, in which it formulated the parameters of the policy of containment as both a foreign policy to limit the spread of the Soviet Union and communism beyond the borders outlined in the Big Three conferences that ended World War II, and in which containment would also mean containing the threat of communism within the borders of the United States. Indeed, the policy document NSC 68 articulated containment as both a domestic and foreign policy that required massive investments in warfare abroad and to some extent political repression at home. The American century, however, would be shaped by a central contradiction. one that was identified by the important, although I would argue overlooked frequently, diplomatic historian from the University of Wisconsin, William Appleman Williams. Williams argued in 1959 in The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, actually he revised it in 1971, and I'm drawing on the 71 version of that book. He argued in The Tragedy of American Diplomacy that the Cold War was merely a new phase in a long history of American imperial expansion. Throughout its history, Williams argued, American power was characterized by three, sometimes complementary, but often contradictory currents. In the realm of ideas and ideals, he argued, and this is an extensive quote from him, American policy is guided by three conceptions. One is the warm, generous, humanitarian impulse to help other people solve their problems. A second is the principle of self-determination applied at the international level, which asserts the rights of every society to establish its own goals of objectives, and then to realize them internally through the means it decides are appropriate. These two ideas, Williams wrote, can be reconciled. Indeed, they complement each other to an extensive degree. But the third idea, he said, entertained by many Americans, is one which insists that other people cannot really solve their problems and improve their lives unless they go about it the same way as the United States. Williams argued that U.S. foreign relations were always framed through the language of benevolence and self-determination, yet were actually guided by a desire to ensure the reproduction of the American way, its systems of government and its economy in non-American places. Williams traced this impulse to the founding impulses of the United States, where he argued that the United States committed to an idea of freedom tied to free enterprise and American futurity tied to expanding markets and control of trade routes and infrastructure. Therefore, according to Williams, the Cold War was not a new formation, but rather a continuation of American foreign relations that were characterized by a central contradiction. The United States would be committed to a bounded national landscape and a boundless marketplace. These commitments, argued Williams, would inevitably produce turmoil and would eventually undermine the American century. Seen in an historical perspective, Williams argued, what we are accustomed to call the Cold War is in reality only the most recent phase of a more general conflict between the established system of Western capitalism and its internal and external opponents. Recognizing that the Cold War is characterized by both continuity and ruptures, I think it is productive to consider the American century as a distinct cultural formation describing the development of U.S. global hegemony. The American century describes a complex web of economic policies, nationalist identity, and foreign relations that began to go through transformations that now seem epochal in scale following the end of the Cold War. My goals in this talk are to paint with broad brushstrokes the contours of the American century during the Cold War and its ultimate unmaking. I will first explain the contradictions, to cite Williams again, that shaped the American century, and then discuss what I see as possible futures after the American century. So the American century and its contradictions. Following World War II, the United States gained economic and military control of the Atlantic world. This included a seat at the head of the economic order established in the Bretton Woods Agreement, as well as a preeminent role in the newly formed international system enshrined by the United Nations and its Security Council. The 1945 Bretton Woods Agreement, which tied the global economy to the gold standard and to U.S. notes, helped the United States secure economic control within the West, particularly over European redevelopment plans after the war. Moreover, as the United States owned over half of the world's official gold reserves after World War II, 574 million ounces at the end of the war, this ensured that an international economic system would orbit around the United States. Throughout the first 3 decades of the Cold War, the U.S. wielded its military supremacy over the developing world by waging proxy wars, secret wars, and counterinsurgency wars across the Third World. both in an effort to push back the gains of socialist and communist organizations, but also to expand existing and to open new American markets. What's perhaps notable about this engagement is the extent to which American power was wielded often in secret, through client states, and often disavowed publicly in order to maintain a vision of American power as moralistic, saving the world for democracy, uplifting people, creating freedom. Again, these are broad strokes sort of moving through the Cold War in order to get to the post-American century. By the 1970s, however, the Atlantic project was wearing thin and beginning to crumble. The US was embroiled in Vietnam, and there was an overvaluation of the US dollar, the bedrock exchange currency of the international monetary system. Nixon broke the Bretton Woods Agreement in what was called the Nixon shock and brought on the era of floating currencies. Here, Nixon acted unilaterally, eschewing the internationalism that had initially established the Bretton Woods system. Nixon's brazen move to terminate this system was one of a series of events that led to the increasing concentration of monetary and geopolitical power in the hands of the United States. The United States also began wielding the international economic system more to its benefits by using the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank to enact political changes in foreign markets through coercive lending strategies. The use of economic shocks in places like Chile in the mid-1970s to coerce political change that favored US economic interests demonstrated a concentration of economic and military power in the US. Perhaps the most significant move toward the making of American hegemony took place in 1985, when Henry Kissinger helped the United States become the international community by moving important deliberations of the United Nations out of the planetary democratic organization of the General Assembly and into the exclusive club of the United Nations Security Council that was then controlled by the permanent three members, the P3 members of the US, the UK, and France. At the same time, the US increasingly used a combined mixture of coercive international fiscal policy with proxy and counterinsurgency warfare in the developing world. As Henry Kissinger then argued the US position, quote, "Empires have no interest in operating within an international system. They aspire to be the international system." The possibilities and limits of American global control of financial markets and development came to a head in the North-South Economic Summit held in Cancun, Mexico in 1981. At that meeting, a committee of representatives from the Global South sought to bring the control of the IMF and World Bank development programs under the wing of the UN General Assembly, among many other things as well. Similar proposals, led by former German Chancellor Willy Brandt, favored a liberal development model characterized by what then the Brandt Commission called North-South cooperation in development. But the neoconservatives won the day. Led by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, these two were undeterred and insistent that development would need to follow along the lines, international development would need to follow along the lines of privatization, free trade, and liberalized financial systems, and not what Reagan referred to as the charity of South-generated development plans. The end of the Cold War, the fall of the wall in 1989 and beyond, the end of the Cold War signaled the realization of American hegemony in economic, geopolitical, and military terms. By 1997, here again I'm moving very quickly over time, by 1997, policymakers who had been an integral part of Reagan's Latin American policy, and in the Iran-Contra affair in particular, began to articulate what they called a project for a new American century. Indeed, they trotted out Luce's argument again and argued that now that the Cold War is over, that the United States won and emerged as a unipolar power, the time was right for a new American century. The project for a new American century was built around the idea that, quote, American leadership is good, both for America and for the world. It sought to establish and to advocate within the US administration to expand US militarism abroad, but it had to do so in new ways, given that the 20th century's major threat presumably the Soviet Union was no longer there as a punching bag. Hence, the project argued the following. We need to increase defense spending significantly if we are to carry out our global responsibilities today and modernize our armed forces for the future. We need to strengthen our ties to democratic allies and to challenge regimes hostile to our interests and values. We need to promote the cause of political and economic freedom abroad, and we need to accept responsibility for America's unique role in preserving and extending an international order friendly to our security, our prosperity, and our principles. From its founding, the leaders of the Project for a New American Century recommended regime change in Iraq. So before the 1991 Persian Gulf War, Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz argued strongly that regime change had to take place. And this was as a means to assert American control over the Middle East, its oil, and most importantly, the global price of oil. By the late 1980s, the United States is not necessarily reliant on Middle Eastern oil for its own economy, but it nevertheless seeks to control the price of oil so that as the United States becomes an oil-producing nation or a greater oil-producing nation, it can control the profits. Donald Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, and others in 1998 argued to President Bill Clinton that regime change in Iraq was necessary. The first Gulf War hadn't done the job. It was in this letter that the Project for a New American Century for the first time spoke of the threat of Saddam Hussein's stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction and the threat they pose to regional security. The rest, they say, is history. The Bush administration realized the Project for a New American Century following 9/11, as all of the authors of the Project New American Century were in the Bush administration, through a series of domestic and international actions that asserted American hegemony over the world. So this is, again, very broad strokes going through a long, deep history. But the talk is not really about the American century. It's about what happens afterwards. And what I want to suggest is that for a brief period, there's the American era. Like, I want to break the post-American century into two frames. One is the American era, in which the United States begins its global war on terror, and then a sort of position after the American era, in which we begin to see the declining futures of American primacy in geopolitical actions. So, actually that's not the one I wanted, but okay. The US war on terror created new categories of enemies, redefined the role of the executive branch within the United States government, and employed torturous legal justifications to justify torture, like interrogations called enhanced interrogations. Beginning shortly after 9/11, the Office of Legal Counsel of the Vice President's office, including Dick Cheney's personal attorney, David Addington, became the center of power in the war on terror, overriding the authority of the Congress and even the judiciary to prosecute suspected terrorists. The Bush administration shifted the responsibility, moreover, for prosecuting captured terrorists from the FBI, which had a long and deep history of interrogating people, to the CIA, which had relatively no experience. Moreover, in using and defining a new category called the illegal enemy combatant, the Bush administration avoided US and international jurisprudence, effectively creating, for at least a 4-year period, a legal black hole in which illegal enemy combatants could seek redress from no legal framework. Moreover, the US relied on proxy governments, importantly in Egypt, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Poland, and Syria, to incarcerate and torture suspected terrorists, including the first captured detainee, John Walker Lindh, an American citizen. This is a picture of Trevor Paglen's photo exhibit on US black sites. It's an amazing art exhibit. And this is the salt pit in Afghanistan, which after September 11, 2001, was used to detain supposed enemy combatants. And finally, the US used its military base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, to detain indefinitely suspected terrorists using not torture, but what the White House counselors called enhanced interrogation techniques, such as waterboarding, all with the sanction of the executive branch's legal counsel, including the lawyer John Yoo. By 2004, when news of the Abu Ghraib photos were released, these were photos obviously that showed the horrific torture that the US soldiers were using against suspected detainees in an Iraqi prison called Abu Ghraib. When news of that broke, the US Congress began to assert oversight over the US torture program and detainee program. Waterboarding was finally defined as torture, and although the prison in Guantanamo remains open, the US began to close its black sites, or at least not use them, and to allow the International Red Cross and human rights lawyers access to detainees, some of whom would be released. Yet around the same time, the US turned to the use of a new strategy in the US war on terror, and that is the use of armed unmanned drones as a useful tool in the war on terror. This is a map showing countries, at least in the US war on terror, where drones were used. This is not updated, but it does show that it sort of begins in 2002. I'll show you in a moment. It really ramps up in 2004 at the moment when it becomes clear that the US government's capture program creates too many legal problems for the administration. So beginning in 2004, the drone program began targeting locations and individuals. It began in 2002, but picks up in 2004 in Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other locations. The drones targeted individuals who were on a US government-sponsored kill list, which still exists today, and the administration turned to targeted assassinations so as, some would argue, not to have to deal with captured detainees who caused legal problems. The drone program even targeted, for extrajudicial assassination, American citizens, including Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son in 2 separate strikes in Yemen. The drone program has escalated under the Obama administration. And I just want to show you quickly an interesting website about the drone program in Pakistan. So this sort of runs on its own just for about 2 minutes. So this is an interesting site, too, where you can actually get data on who were killed, where, and why. So you can see among the kill list, 50 people in Pakistan have been hit, taken out. But the estimated fatalities is actually 3,213. And I'll come back to this in a moment. This obviously creates a huge diplomatic problem for the United States. In fact, recently, the young Nobel Prize winner Malala Yousafzai had told President Obama in her meeting with him, I also expressed my concerns that drone attacks are fueling terrorism. Innocent victims are killed in these acts, and they lead to resentment among the Pakistani people. If we refocus our efforts on education, it will make a big impact. So again, I'm glossing through a rather large history of the US war on terror in order to suggest that in the moment of the American era, we see a global battlefield in the making, in which the US is redefining legality, going outside of the Geneva Conventions as well as US domestic law in order to prosecute something else, something very different. all, and in the process, making what some have called the entire world, a battlefield. Now, by 2010, even earlier, we began to see a number of essays and criticisms about American power and whether it was in decline. This in part happened as a result of the 2008 economic crisis within the United States, the rise of Occupy movements, and other events like that. And so it was in the late 2010s, or 2008 to 2011, that political economists and foreign relations experts began questioning whether America has a future, is the American century over, is American empire in decline? And so I wanted to sort of go over some of those arguments and then sort of conclude with where I think we are now. Political economists and world systems theorists have argued that the contradictions that William Appleman Williams identified at the outset of the Cold War are not merely the contradictions of political liberalism, or of liberal empire, as Williams called it, but are more fundamentally contradictions applicable to capitalism. Hence, Giovanni Arrighi and Emanuel Wallerstein have each argued separately that the American century is merely a stage in capitalist development, a cycle of accumulation and surplus that will inevitably decline or transform as a result of the flexibility of capital. These international and world systems theorists have argued that beginning as early as the 1970s, global capital has eclipsed the nation form as the most important unit of global power. For example, in his forecast of the end of American hegemony, Emanuel Wallerstein argues that while the US remains economically and militarily dominant, it no longer maintains its global prestige, nor its ability to dictate global events as it did during the Cold War. For Wallerstein, then, the end of the American empire is partly due to its replacement, to the replacement of the nation with the global financial system, as well as, he argues, the emergence of new economic and geopolitical rivals, particularly Japan and Germany, in Wallerstein's view. Similarly, international relations scholar Giovanni Arrighi has argued that the end of the American century marks the decline of American global hegemony. And he reminds us that Gramsci's notion of hegemony relies not only on the notion of top-down dominance, but also the production of consent from below. While the US was hegemonic during the Cold War, Arrighi argues, this status has changed, particularly in the wake of the US war on terror. Now, Arrighi argues, the US is merely globally dominant. It exerts top-down power, but without any consent from below. And so therefore, for him, this is no longer a system of American hegemony. Importantly, Arrighi's diagnosis of American geopolitical power is tied to his understanding of global and transnational capitalist development. As he argued in his book, The Long 20th Century, US geopolitical power was merely a phase of capitalist development rooted to the territory of the United States. Overaccumulation, he argues, has led the US to expand territorially through war and geopolitical power. Yet the ability of the US to expand its surplus is waning as it becomes more difficult for it to dictate world events in ways that favor its economic wishes. Moreover, Arrighi forecasts, quote, a recentering of the global political economy on East Asia that will further characterize the United States, quote, dominance without hegemony. Stephen Walt, in his essay, The End of the American Era, has argued that when a state stands alone at the pinnacle of power, there's nowhere to go but down. Walt argues that the American era of Cold War decades were characterized by an inflated sense of peril and bipolarity. In reality, he argues, US hegemony was secure throughout the Cold War as the US operated without a serious military or economic rival. The fall of the Soviet Union, however, coupled with the decline of the US economy, has brought the American era to an end. There are new emerging eras of geopolitical power, he argues, most prominently in Asia. Moreover, for Walt, the Arab Spring, or the uprisings that have been called the American Spring, at least in the West, most clearly demonstrate the decline of the American era as the US has been a marginal influence in developments across the Middle East and North Africa. However, Walt notes, while the American era is coming to a close, American power, like Arrighi argues, is still dominant. It is merely less influential. Hence, according to Walt, the real question was always whether what one might term the American era was nearing its end. Specifically, might the United States remain the strongest global power, but be unable to exercise the same influence it once enjoyed? If this is the case, and I believe it is, then Washington must devise a grand strategy that acknowledges this new reality, but still uses America's enduring assets to advance the national interest. So what comes after the American century? I guess I'm less interested in the question of whether America has a future or whether America is in decline, especially given that the United States still exerts a form of global military power that is unprecedented. Let's not forget that today the United States has special operation forces. These are military personnel who operate beyond the reach of international law, covering 60% of the globe. The US still has very little military rival. This is a map showing all of the dots represent places where there are US bases abroad. The United States is the largest renter of property outside of the United States for military bases. However, I think it's probably accurate to say that the US economy is no longer globally supreme, obviously. Just this week, it was reported that China has recently surpassed the US for the world's largest economy. But perhaps more significantly is that American influence, its primacy, is in decline. It can no longer dictate events across the globe in the ways that it once did, and this is in part due to the renewed economic strength of new multilateral coalitions of states that emerged from the global south. I'm referring to the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that have established trade and other economic policies beyond the networks of US-led neoliberal economic policy. And I think it's also important to note that American power is no longer wielded with the same kind of moralistic language that it was during the Cold War. The war on terror is no longer, I mean, it is about protecting the free world, but I think that much of that moralistic language that was used in a previous era are wearing thin, particularly among the US public. I think we can see the declining influence of the United States very starkly, or at least I could from Beirut, following the 2011 beginning of a constellation of social movements that in the Arab world were called revolutions, but in the West were called springs. The US miscues on Egypt and Syria were most revealing to me. The Arab uprisings made starkly visible the declining geopolitical influence of the United States in the Arab world. And although the uprisings were not directed wholly against the United States, or not even most of it, but were against the authoritarian regimes there, it was very clear in the region that the authoritarian regimes were there because of US support and because of US tutelage, and because US economic policy over the region prized security over democracy. The US attempted to shape what the US began to call the Arab Spring in its own image, as a kind of American awakening in the Arab world. When the uprisings began in Egypt, the United States defended its ally, Hosni Mubarak, by arguing that Mubarak was not a dictator and that he should remain in power. Vice President Joe Biden and US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton argued that Mubarak was not a dictator and that the protests would eventually subside. Vice President Biden announced on US television, "Mubarak has been an ally of ours in a number of things, and he's been very responsible on geopolitical interests in the region, which include the actions Egypt has taken relative to normalizing the relationship with Israel. I would not refer to him as a dictator," unquote. Secretary of State Clinton did not initially call for Mubarak to step down, but instead called for what she called contained change that presumably would appease the democratic aspirations of the protesters without upsetting the geopolitical stability Mubarak afforded the United States and its main ally in the region, Israel. As the uprisings grew, however, it became apparent that Mubarak would be deposed by a popular rebellion. And US policymakers pivoted away from its support for Mubarak and began to celebrate the victory of the Arab youth, who had presumably been influenced not by their own agency and intellect, but by the power of George Bush's US freedom agenda, which included the benevolent imposition of US tech firms like Google, Twitter, and Facebook across the region. Some scholars began to argue that the uprisings vindicated Bush's freedom agenda, which describes a set of democracy promotion initiatives Bush instituted after 9/11. Among the central components of the freedom agenda, by the way, was the Middle East Partnership Initiative, or MEPI, which funds promising young Arab students to study America in US institutions, among other things. But more common in the US media was a celebration of the capacity of US-led social media companies like Google, Twitter, and Facebook to inspire and facilitate the youth uprisings. Some called the uprisings the Facebook revolutions and assumed that it was US-led modernity that enabled the uprisings. Now, the purpose of my discussion here is not to argue the role of social media in social movements. This is an ongoing debate. But what does interest me are how social media got read as American culture and how this reading shaped Americans' knowledge about the uprisings. In the Facebook revolution mantra, the uprisings were merely the Arab youth imitating American youth. And this particular narrative asserted a sort of American exceptionalism in that it posited American benevolence in the Arab world and fetishized US-defined democracy as universal goods. But of course, we know that was not the end of the story in the Arab uprisings. And it was a far more complex set of rebellions than the Facebook revolution mantra would allow. Now, here's yet another break in my talk where I want to just sort of reflect on where I think things are now. Today, the United States has returned to Iraq, the place where I started my discussion of the post-American century. But it imagines that it is fighting not a particular contemporary enemy, but instead a centuries-long sectarian battle involving Shia Islam. Yet the sectarian reading of the current rebellions in Syria and Iraq ignore an important fact. From 1991 until today, the US has tampered with Iraq through carpet bombings, boots on the ground, shock and awe, no-fly zones, and sanctions. The result of nearly 20 years of imperialism in that country are the following. During the era of UN-led sanctions on Iraq, beginning in 1990, 500,000 children died. And since 2003, 500,000 Iraqis have died in war-related deaths. There are estimates that go much bigger than that as well. It has recently been reported that in cities like Fallujah and Mosul, the particular areas where ISIL or Daesh is most popular, the US occupying forces use weapons that contain depleted uranium. So that today, the birth defect rate in Fallujah is 14 times higher than it was in Nagasaki following the US use of the atomic bomb. This is a chart showing the birth defect rate, or the under 5 mortality rate in Iraq. The bottom line shows the trend that was taking place from 1980 onward. So had there been no intervention, presumably Iraq would have a declining 5-year mortality rate. But if you look in this area, you see this is the actual rate. It spiked precipitously. According to Iraqi journalist Dar Jamal, in 1991, for example, there were 40 registered cases of cancer out of 100,000 Iraqis. By 1995, 4 years after that war, that number had jumped to 800 out of 100,000 Iraqis. And then by 2005, that number had doubled. And so what this has generated is, from 2004 to this day, we are seeing a rate of congenital malformations in the city of Fallujah that has surpassed even that in the aftermath of the wake of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that were, this is a conversation that is being quoted, that nuclear bombs were dropped on at the end of World War II. So America's Iraq experiment completely devastated the Iraqi state and inflamed an already fragile yet successful multi-sectarian society. The 1991 US invasion led the Iraqi state to lose complete control of its northern Kurdish region, while the 2003 invasion broke up the rest of the state. Is it any surprise that Daesh, or what in the West we call ISIS, has formed in the wake of this devastation? For more than 10 years, the organization sought to provide services that the Iraqi state could not. But the post-American century should not only be read in terms of American geopolitical power abroad. We shall also ask what comes after the American century within the United States. The long process of deindustrialization that began in the 1970s seemed to come to its peak in 2008 with the deep economic recessions, the failure of banks that were, quote, too large to fail, and the mortgage crisis. And just as global corporations have seemed to eclipse the nation state as the organizing units of the global economy, with the 2010 Supreme Court Citizens United decision, the corporation would seem to have parity, if not supremacy, over the individual. In the post-American century, the policies of economic neoliberalization, privatization, and coercive lending that were once directed at the developing world have all come home to the United States. In 2013, the great industrial city of Detroit, the city that represented the hopes and dreams of the American century, went bankrupt. The state assumed control of the city, handing decisions to an unelected private businessman. But these businessmen have gutted already fragile city employee pensions while privatizing key infrastructure in the city. In an attempt to eliminate the city's water department's debt, the financial overseer of that city hired a private demolition firm to shut off water to residents who were 2 months delinquent on their bill. This meant 150,000 people who live next to the 5th largest freshwater reserve in the world, Lake Michigan, did not have the right to water in their private home. The United Nations, responding to the crisis in Detroit, recently released a statement on this policy, arguing that disconnection of water services because of a failure to pay due to lack of means constitutes a violation of human right to water and other international human rights. While the enforced economic austerity regularly visited on the developing world during the American century has recently come home, so too have the militarization of everyday life we see in foreign battlefields seeped into the everyday realities of American cities. Following the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, state and federal authorities turned to the private military contracting firm Blackwater. Wake up. Oh, wait. I have to go to, sorry. Turned to Blackwater, who helped the US military secure foreign battlefields like Mosul, Iraq, to protect private property in New Orleans. According to a report in Mother Jones magazine, quote, the Blackwater operators described their mission in New Orleans as, quote, securing neighborhoods, as if they were talking about Sadr City. When National Guard troops descended on the city, the Army Times described their role as fighting the, quote, insurgency in the city. Brigadier General Gary Jones, who commanded Louisiana National Guard's Joint Task Force, told the paper, quote, this place is going to look like Somalia. We're going to go out and take this city back. This will be a combat operation to get this city under control. We've seen several instances where the war on terror abroad have brought tactics and technology back to the United States. Throughout the Iraqi war, the US military sought training on house-to-house warfare and counterinsurgency operations under the tutelage of Israeli Defense Forces. US forces observed the Israeli siege on the West Bank refugee camp of Jenin, making Israel a laboratory of sorts for US counterinsurgency efforts in Iraq. But more recently, US urban police forces have sought IDF tutelage because within urban America, policing is increasingly framed as counterinsurgency operations. Police forces across the US, including the APD, now receive training in counterinsurgency warfare from Israel, whose occupation of the West Bank and siege of Gaza are increasingly models for post-American century warfare. The police force in Ferguson, Missouri, has participated in Israel's counterinsurgency training program. Since 1997, the Defense Department's 1033 program, and I'm concluding here, sent military surplus used in the war on terror to local police agencies, but also to school districts and universities. The Pinellas County School District in Florida purchased 24 M16 rifles through this program. The San Diego Unified School District picked up a mine-resistant vehicle. The Los Angeles Unified School District, which has its own police force, purchased an armored vehicle. and our friends at Ohio State University picked up this nice car. What comes after the American century is an increasingly dystopian future in which the boundaries of warfare are non-existent. The US is engaged in what geographer Derek Gregory calls the everywhere war. And yet, while I've painted the post-American century in somewhat dystopic colors, we should recognize that the post-American century is one in which the US maintains military hegemony, but loses economic and geopolitical primacy. Within this context, wars and economic policies executed with brutal outcomes in the developing world ricochet back to the United States, turning once prosperous urban cities like Detroit into battlegrounds for militarized policing and hostile economic takeovers and resource wars. At the same time, the post-American century is one in which new multipolarities may ascend. In the realm of the international system, the decline of US prestige may enable the possibilities for regional solutions to emerge from within the global South. The BRICS countries may be a model for South-South cooperation that charts a different path forward than the US vision. Conflicts in the Middle East are the byproducts of decades of colonial violence. The US has no good options in the region, in my view, and only a coalition of multipolar regional powers beyond the West, including Iran and Saudi Arabia, which have been engaged in their own Cold War for a long time, are equipped to engage the divided loyalties in that region. But we are also seeing new multipolarities within the US. As the military hardware and tactics used in US overseas wars on terror increasingly migrate to US urban cities, people are beginning to realize new affinities and to identify across global communities. This, by the way, are US drone programs being used by police forces within the United States. This is why there's been a significant outpouring of solidarity between the protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, and those in Gaza. Extrajudicial execution and militarized policing dominate both regions. We saw similar transnational examples of people's solidarity in the Occupy Wall Street movement that linked austerity programs globally. But we are also beginning to see in places like Detroit and Ferguson the makings of a people's movement to redefine the role of the state. Detroit, pictured here, is either the dystopian present and future, or, according to Grace Lee Boggs, a great activist in the city of Detroit, Detroit is a new world in the making, as abandoned homes and lands are being reclaimed through Detroit's new people's agricultural farms and freedom schools, operated not by the private firms hired to manage Detroit, but by local communities who realize, in the words of Grace Lee Boggs, that they are the change they've been waiting for. This is a new urban farm in this blighted city. In Detroit, people have established civilian police oversight boards and have attempted to block water shutoffs, claiming entitlement to natural resources in the city itself in opposition to the outside forces of private business leaders. So, last comment. The United States is still in the throes of transformation. This is perhaps the result of a new regime of capitalist accumulation that will shift to new geographies, according to Origi, or it's the rise of different gravities of power, of geopolitical power, like the BRIC states. Or perhaps it's the failure itself of the American empire to successfully frame the war on terror in moralistic terms. That is to say, the US has lost the influence, the primacy argument. The post-American century, perhaps, will be a multipolar world. And it seems likely that within the United States, there will be growing popular movements to reclaim the powers of the state that have been given over to private interests. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Alex. Also, I forgot to mention that Les is the chair of the program director of Peace Studies and the incoming chair of anthropology. And right after this talk, I'm convinced that international studies and American studies join forces. We're already on the same floor. And erase that arbitrary line that separates these disciplines. Of course, Peace Studies will be joining next. And also, I had forgotten that the feminist research one of our sponsors for the whole series, and I thank them very much. And now we're trying to keep that to an extra 15 minutes as people have to leave. But I am very happy to introduce David Henkel, who is giving this evening's lecture at 5:30 called Shared Securities. I think we will have a lot more to discuss. I hope you will come back to that. But for now, he's going to give comments and begin the discussion on Alex's talk, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. Actually, several of the slides you used, anyone who's here this evening will also see there. There's some convergent themes here. I was quite taken by what Alice was saying. I was scribbling and dropping ink all over myself, but I think I can read a couple of the notes that I made. I just want to lift up some things that I heard strongly in Alice's presentation. One was in his reference to Henry Luce, and I was marveling again at how the titles of the four main publications, Time, Life, Fortune, and Sports Illustrated, sort of encapsulate American culture then and now. And to some degree, it allows us to live in a perception of the world which is defined thus-wise, rather than in a more sophisticated way, which deals with the power relations which are under discussion. Secondly, the reference to William Appleton Williams's perceptions, to my mind, also underscores the ingenuousness, perhaps, of American thinking for a long time. The assertion that that we are motivated by generosity and humane outreach toward others in need, and that we value self-determination. Those are themes which have been used to reinforce the official ideology without having to dig down into the dynamics which undergird it. The other couple of things that I think came out of that were clearly the notion of the decline of U.S. hegemony and the shift from physical power exercised through military and police force to economic power, and then the decline of that. And so the repositioning that's going on right now within the American system, at least as I see it, and as I read what Alex has presented to us, is partly a tension between a scramble to try to redefine a point of advantage that the U.S. can exercise. The fact that we are borrowing from Israel techniques for the suppression of subject populations means that we also have to ask, who are the subject populations here? So what justifies the use of those instruments here unless we believe the same kinds of threats to the state exist here? They are not externalized graphically the way they are in the West Bank and in Gaza, but they exist within. And so we are actually exercising, deploying the same kinds of instruments to control populations. I'm reminded of a theme that kept on being mentioned in the 60s when I became politically aware. It can't happen here, it can't happen here. We need to ask ourselves, is that really true? I think actually it's the answer to that is evident. But the other point of tension between the scramble of the elite forces in the United States is with the resurgence of people's voice. That is, the fact that people are unwilling, after they begin to realize what's been happening, and they experience the circumvention of their powers and the undercutting of what we have all been taught as is our national ideal and our rule of law. People begin to reassert their sense of what it should be. Not the official version of what it supposedly is, but it is the voice of ordinary people banding together, which in fact created uprisings throughout history, certainly have their own identity in Middle East uprisings, irrespective of the technologies of Facebook or of other kinds of more policing leverage. So my sense is that the direction for the future is that there may be an advantage to America losing its world position, because it refocuses us as ordinary people upon building from within based upon a return to civic values that grow out of a more communitarian set of dynamics. Those are my offerings.
Questions, right?
Yeah, thank you, Alex, for, I think, a very excellent and generally correct way of looking at the past and the present. I wanted to ask you, however, about the wild card and always the elephant in the room that is often missed, and that's the environment and the life support system of the planet, which is being degraded in very terrible ways. And as we continue to look at the political economy or historical issues and not look at what's going on with the earth and the anthropogenic impacts of this degrading of the life support system, and how the United States or other countries, are going to be dealing with this, because they don't know exactly what will happen. Right now, and you please do comment on it, one would think that if half of Manhattan got flooded, there would be some kind of positive response to global warming, to all the associated issues. What do you see happening as we concentrate on militarism, imperialism, totalitarianism, and not deal with what's happening to our planet?
I mean, in part, I think you answered that question, right? And I think you say it very well. You're right, it's not something that I engaged in this talk, but I do think another way to reframe this question is the question of Detroit and what's happening there with the water shutoffs, is that these aren't merely, or shouldn't just be read merely through economic neoliberalization and privatization, but should also be read as resource wars that are the result of a kind of environmental injustices that have existed for a long time. And in that sense, I think reading the depleted uranium statistics in Fallujah is also that if were these to be read as environmental conflicts as well as problems of empire and militarization, perhaps that might also lead to other kinds of solidarities, right, that are rooted towards notions of of environmental justice. So, I mean, I think you're right. I think it probably is a weakness of something that's not something I study or know much about, but I agree, and I think that, this is a picture from the Boggs Center in Detroit, which is doing a lot of this work, in which they have reframed the question of deindustrialization as a question of environmental justice. So I think in some ways they're doing that.
And if I could also add, the lecture we heard on Monday at 5:30 specifically targeted sustainability and had all the charts anyone would want. And in my mind, actually, the two together offer a good complement, because you cannot criticize the state of climate change without talking about people, nor can you criticize what's happening politically without that. So I agree, I also agree with you, and just wanted to point out that taken together, I think many of the speakers come back to several problems. So, yeah.
First of all, thank you for the talk. I was wondering if you would say that with the decline of American hegemony and the possible rise of multipolarity in the world, that we would also see a shift away from the domination of Western values in the world and in forums such as the United Nations, when, for example, the BRIC countries are getting stronger and stronger? What would you say? Like, do we also see a shift in values?
Well, I think that, I mean, it's a great question. I think that if we were to see the kind of ascendance of the BRICS countries, we would also begin to see in a global marketplace the ideas and cultures of those BRIC countries begin to also dominate. I think one of the issues, I mean, I don't want to overplay the argument that American economy is in decline. I think, I mean, I'm not an economist, but I think that the United States still controls intellectual property laws in such a way that I think that American culture still remains fairly globally hegemonic, although there are obviously places where it's not. But across Lebanon, where I was for the last 3 years, American culture is the standard mainstream culture of Lebanon. It's not, it's everywhere. So in that regard, I don't see that happening soon. But I would say that part of the critiques against American power are also critiques against American conceptions of democracy and American conceptions of freedom. So, for example, the kind of, even just last week, or a couple weeks ago, when President Obama defined U.S. engagement in Iraq, what he told the global community was, help is on the way, as though America is still the cowboy on the white horse. And I don't think that's how that is being read in that region at all. Now, there are a large number of people in the region who want the U.S. to be involved. In fact, there are a large number of people who hope that the U.S. would be involved in Syria as early as 2011. But there are many people who think that U.S. bombing can never help in the region. So that's just to say that I think that part of losing prestige will also be losing the ability to control the narrative about U.S. power.
Well, guys, I like your lecture. Cool.
Thank you.
I noticed I want to ask you something. I mean, so now, U.S. involvement, has caused a lot of, ways perpetuated a cycle of violence and PCEs. At the same time, I want to ask you if you would argue that, or if you at least think that an intervention like an isolationist approach in this new century would be safe for both the world and also to the U.S.
Are you saying, am I advocating that the U.S. just become an isolationist power that doesn't engage globally?
Right, in terms of American foreign policy.
Yeah.
Would you say that?
No, I don't think that's what I would argue.
No.
I mean, I think, the United States, if the argument that others have made and that I reproduced here is that the United States has become the global community, that the United States wields supremacy within the United Nations Security Council, can we imagine China saying we're instituting a no-fly zone over Iraq? Right? It's fine for the United States to say that, but I don't think we could imagine any other country that would say no-fly zone now. So the point is that if that's the truth, that the U.S. is globally dominant, or that it's been hegemonic, even if that's changing, then I'm not sure, and this is not my specialty, but I'm not sure that a full disengagement is either possible or a good thing, right? There are ways for the United States to be involved that don't involve bombs, right? That don't involve drones. So, I'm speaking personally here now. I think that U.S. intervention in the Middle East, bombing in the Middle East, has never produced anything good. And I can't see it doing it in this case either.
Thank you.
Thank you.